The video you're about to watch got way too long, so I wanted to record a quick summary. Back when we started reviewing cameras, the difference between each generation of camera would show this like huge improvement in the raw still image quality. We'd see like the noise would get much better, the dynamic range would get much better, and that's really changed. Like it's completely leveled off. It's kind of like Moore's law has died, and now the improvements that we see from one generation to the next are so insignificant you usually can't tell at all, and yet the community who reviews cameras still largely focuses on the image quality, both the reviewers and the people consuming the reviews, and it gets ridiculous. I see people looking at two different sensors and seeing big differences in image quality where there are absolutely none. And some of this is just wishful thinking, some of it is people seeing things where there is nothing, and some of it is a margin of error, because testing sensors is really difficult because light in the world, the sun and incandescent lights and everything can change so much that it introduces this fairly big margin of error that can completely crush these tiny little differences that we now see. How big are these errors? They can be a stop or two. Even in controlled conditions, the errors can be like a quarter of a stop. Whereas the difference between one generation of sensor to the next might only improve by 1/10 of a stop. You can see that 1/4 of a stop is pretty significant, and 2 stops is absolutely huge. And I think these errors might be the reason that I see so many people incorrectly stating that they see a full stop of image quality improvement from one generation of sensor to the next that has the same size sensor. Let's say somebody's testing 2 cameras back to back, and in the first, the sun is behind the cloud, and the second the sun moves out from behind the cloud, you would see a full stop of improvement in the image quality between those two. And then that person might publish that review, and everybody who saw that full stop of improvement would be excited about it and want to share that result and talk about it. And so that exciting result would get shared a lot more than somebody who came along and said, hey, I compared those 2 sensors and they're about the same. They don't seem to be any different. Like that's, the people share the most exciting result. But as a result, there's a lot of misinformation being spread, and people are spending money on cameras hoping to get these sorts of improvements when they're not actually getting it in raw still image quality. In reality, the only time you'd see a stop of improvement in raw still image quality is if you compared a modern camera against a 10 or 11-year-old camera. So I'd like to see people think less about little image quality differences in cameras that have basically the same size sensor, and start thinking more about maybe the entire lens infrastructure, and think about things like features, things like sensor stabilization and eye autofocus that have made a big difference in the latest generations of cameras. Like those are good reasons to upgrade, but the improvements in sensor image quality probably aren't. Okay, here's your full nerdy video.
Technical camera reviews, nowadays they're mostly really meaningless, but a lot of people are still really focused on pixel peeping and, oh, is this new camera, is the image quality slightly better than other cameras? And when people ask me about cameras, they aren't like what's the most fun camera to use? What camera is like best at tracking for sports? They often ask me just like, which one has the very best image quality? And I think that's kind of like a dead conversation. So I'm going to talk about this, and I'm also going to talk about some serious problems that I see in people's camera reviews where the end information will end up being either completely wrong or misleading. And that includes like very technical tests from some of the most prominent testers. Sometimes there are just like clear flaws in the methodology. And I want to say that I'm talking about still images. I'm not talking about video quality when I talk about these things. Video is different. Video is actually still making improvements in leaps and bounds. Like the difference between the GH5 and the GH5S was a huge difference, but we don't see that in the stills world anymore. The first time I really appreciated a difference in cameras, I went from the original 5D to the 5D Mark II, and we were shooting stock photography, which was dominated by medium format cameras. So our 5D, we were constantly getting pictures rejected for too much noise and not enough sharpness. And so that became a very real priority for us. And when we did get pictures submitted, it was because we put a ton of post-processing in them. So making up for that low image quality was costing us a lot. So the 5D Mark II came out, it had way better image quality than the original 5D, and it had more megapixels and stuff. And so suddenly we didn't have to spend so much time in post, and we got to take more pictures, and it was like totally worth the investment, and the image quality was so important. And also the only difference between that camera and this camera was like the image quality. Like the controls didn't change. It didn't suddenly have eye detect autofocus or an electronic viewfinder. And then in 2012, the next big leap I think of was when Nikon released the D800 and the D800E. and suddenly megapixel count went up to 36 megapixels, and it had so much like extra dynamic range out of it. And in a very practical way, that was saving us time in post and just generally improving the appearance of our images. And then that's pretty much it. Like since 2012, it's been 6 years now. I can't say I have seen an improvement in sensor technology that has been big enough for me to say, oh man, it's totally worth upgrading just for the image quality. Like if you're shooting with the D800E and you're okay with the focusing system and the other, like no Wi-Fi or touchscreen or tilt, if you're okay with like the functional sort of missing features that it has, if you just go on image quality, you should just all go get a used D800E because it's not, the new cameras, the D850, it's a little bit better, but nobody's going to make, nobody's really going to notice. And this is kind of how I feel about all the reviews that are still really nitpicking differences in sensor tech. There's still so much discussion about it. And ultimately it's like, it doesn't really matter, right? There are lots of things that matter, like the story in a picture, the lighting, the mood, the emotion that you convey, the subject and the contrast of the subject and subject separation. All that stuff is so incredibly important in photography, whether you take it with your smartphone or not. The differences in pixels don't matter anymore. So let's now talk about some of the problems I see when people are testing sensors. The first is I see a lot of photographers out there shooting side-by-side tests with different cameras, and they're doing it outdoors, like during the day. And right away, there's, in my experience, trying to do these tests and using a scientific process, I've realized it's essentially impossible to get meaningful results shooting outside, side by side, like taking turns, period. And the first is if there are any clouds in the sky. A cloud can pass in front of the sun and it will totally change your light. But it could be several stops. And when you look at the difference between a camera like the D810 and the D850, the differences are way less than a stop. Like maybe you're talking about 1/10 of a stop or something. If you look at the difference between an A7R2 and an A7R3, again, you're talking about like 1/10 of a stop. Maybe it's 0.2 stops, but it's not like multiple stops. So if this light varies by a little bit, then your results are completely shot. You'll never be able to appreciate that difference. So clouds, of course, are a big deal, but it doesn't have to be a full cloud going in front of the sun. If it's an overcast day, clouds are not a perfectly smooth layer. You might think you're getting even lighting, but you're not. Those clouds are moving, there are varying thicknesses, and you will get different amounts of light. There's a reason I figured this out. I figured this out the hard way because I tried to do more like real world sort of side-by-side comparison shots. But my methodology is I'll shoot with camera A, camera B, camera C, camera D, and then I go back to shooting with camera A. I shoot with the first camera, I also make it the last camera, and then I always compare the results from the same camera from the first and the last shoot. And if I don't see exactly the same results from that camera, then that means that something about the testing conditions changed over the course of the shoot. And I don't know that other people have this element of control in it, but as I've done this, I've realized like most of the time, my results are meaningless. And that's why it's kind of important to have that scientific control in there. And it ends up getting frustrating because like I want to provide you a real nice landscape shot instead of just some stupid studio shot, except that the world changes too much to have any sort of meaningful results in there. I also say, even if it's a totally clear day, you might think, you're okay, sun's high in the sky. I tried that same test, and over the course of 30 minutes, I lost 1/3 of a stop of light just from the movement of the sun. But nowadays, where sensor technology is improving by 1/10 of a stop, no, it's going to get totally lost in the margin of error. Indoor shots have tons of problems too. First, if you're in a room that is not sealed off with light, then so much light is going to spill in that it's going to alter your results substantially. And again, it can just be 1/10 of a stop to make everything completely meaningless. Again, I figured this out the hard way by doing my own tests, but including the scientific control, and then having to throw my hands up and be like, all right, great, I have to start over from scratch now again. Artificial lights, same thing. LEDs, incandescents, fluorescence, they all warm up over time. The amount of brightness out of a bulb changes. Your eyes don't notice this, but guess what? If you're doing camera tests and you do my shoot at first and shoot at last thing, you'll see that there can be a substantial variation in the amount of light that comes out. So if people are shooting indoors and they're using artificial light, the only way those tests have any meaning is if they are using a very precise light meter to measure those lights, especially if they're recording them on different days. Now, I'll come into the studio to do one of my sample tests, and I will shoot camera A, B, C, D, and then camera A again. And if I check camera A at the beginning and end, and the light levels are precisely the same, then I feel comfortable with that. I always let them warm up, and at some point they kind of even out. But I see a lot of people doing indoor tests, and they're shooting them on multiple days because, the new XH1 comes out, and they don't want to have to go back and test it against every other single camera in the world. So they keep one stationary studio shot. How is it that they're making sure that the light levels are exactly the same when artificial light levels can vary so much? And over the course of the life of a bulb, it will output different amounts of light, like to great degrees. It can certainly be more than 1/10 of a stop, which is enough to completely scrap any of your results. I don't know. I don't know how they are assuring this. We never do tests spread across more than just a few minutes. I try to make sure I get them done as soon as possible, but certainly not across different days. Light meters could help you make sure that the amount of light coming out of the lights is consistent. But I did a quick search, and the most precise light meter I could find was only precise down to 1/10 of a stop. So you could still have quite a bit of variation in there, enough that you'd be able to see a difference between two cameras when there wasn't one, or enough that it might skew one camera to look better than the other. Other problems that I see people have in their tests is that they will use different lenses to test a sensor, but with the same f-stop. So maybe you decide to test cameras from 3 different manufacturers, and you want to use a 25 millimeter lens, but there's no one lens that you can put on all the camera bodies. So you just use some lens set at 25 millimeters and f4. That f4 isn't always going to be the same for different lenses, because different lenses can have the same f-stops, but they can have different t-stops. So we have a video on the difference between f-stops and t-stops. And shockingly, a lot of tests don't distinguish that those are the same. They just kind of say, hey, the t-stops are probably close enough. And again, that would be true if, having, say, 0.2 or 0.3 stops, margin of error is close enough, then maybe it wouldn't matter. But nowadays, when the improvements are so small and incremental, it really does matter. And you really need to be testing with the same model of lens, if not the exact same lens. Or you need to make sure that you need to actually have your lenses tested to determine the t-stop in a very precise way to ensure that they are at least close enough. I also see people who are trying to test the cameras, but they'll use different models of lenses that have different sharpnesses. And maybe the tester doesn't even intend for people to compare the sharpness, but people do. And then they'll say, oh, I can clearly see that the Nikon is sharper than the Fuji. But then I'll look at the lenses, and the Fuji will have a $100 lens on it, and the Nikon will have an $800 lens on it. That's not a test of the camera. That's a test of that specific camera and lens. That can be useful if you're testing a combination, but don't try to extrapolate the difference and think that it's going to have an effect when you use whatever camera and body combination that you're planning to use. The sharpness is determined by both the camera and the lens, and you can't separate those two. And I want to make some practical points here. First, my more technical audience, we like stuff that can be measured. We like stuff that can be counted. Like, you can count megapixels, 40's more than 30, and that feels good. This camera has 800 focusing points instead of 25 focusing points, and that's better. Bigger is better and stuff. It's very hard to measure more subjective things. But unfortunately, for those nerds out there, unfortunately, sometimes the subjective stuff makes a way bigger difference than the technical stuff that can be measured. I want to make the point that focusing accuracy is way more important than the number of megapixels in your camera. I have used high megapixel cameras that had imprecise focusing systems. Like go out there and check out, especially the original A7R. It had a 42 megapixel sensor, but it didn't focus very well. And in the real world, you're like, oh, okay, I have this spectacular sensor here, but I can't get it to focus accurately. And so I have 42 megapixels of stuff that's slightly out of focus, and it might as well be a 2 megapixel camera, right? Stabilization is also more important than megapixels. I have a 50 megapixel 5DSR, and I'll put my super sharp Canon 24-70 f2.8 on there, and I'll go out and take shots, and then I'll get back home, and even though I'm shooting at 4 times the reciprocal rule, a bunch of my shots will have camera shake in them because the reciprocal rule doesn't matter anymore when you have high megapixel cameras and super sharp lenses. But then I can, pick up a stabilized XH1 with only 24 megapixels, and I'll actually get sharper pictures a lot of the time. It's this very practical improvement that can't easily be measured. Again, even when you're way beyond the reciprocal rule, even just in just any sort of shooting, portraits, whatever, that matters more. Stabilization also matters more than ISO. If you have to be at a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second to not get camera shake in your pictures, but you pick up a camera that has a stabilized sensor or something, and you can now shoot at 1/50th of a second, guess what? You're shooting 2 stops slower. You're using an ISO that's 2 stops lower. You're gathering 4 times more light, and your images are going to be vastly more clean. And that matters more than the 0.1 stops of high ISO noise improvement that we see between generations of cameras. So if you're analyzing these camera reviews, stop thinking about these numbers so much and start thinking about the practical features that camera manufacturers are putting into cameras that will really, in the real world, improve not just your photographic quality, but the quality of the experience that you're having. I see a lot of problems in lens tests too. The first I see is a lot of people just shoot through glass and then use it as some sort of sharpness comparison. People will be in a hotel room because maybe they're on a press junket or something, or maybe it's raining and they don't. Okay, glass is not optical quality. It's going to completely wreck the sharpness. Same thing with atmospheric conditions. I know you want to shoot a nice landscape photo for your test, but the mountains are probably far away, right? There's a bunch of air between you and those mountains, and that's going to kill your megapixels. You can take a 50 megapixel picture of some faraway mountains, and I promise you're getting like 8 megapixels of detail, sometimes less, depending on how much haze there is in the air. Air is never clear. There's always some interference in there. That's why so many tests are done like indoors, looking at a test chart, which I know that's not fun. I also want to make the point that focus isn't perfect. When you move far away, you don't really have to worry about as much about focus because the way depth of field works is far away stuff. You just have a lot more range. But once you start to move close, I find that there is no depth of field whatsoever. And I have found that focusing systems are never precise enough at test chart range to rely on them completely. So typically my tests will involve me taking a camera and just trying to focus on whatever test scene I've set up. And then I will typically do contrast detection and do that a couple of times, like refocus the lens manually and then let it autofocus again. And I'll take several shots like that, and then I will use the phase detect focus if it's a separate option. And then sometimes I'll even try manually focusing. And what I've learned from this whole process of really scrutinizing these very technical images is that, for one, no human can manually focus as precise as autofocus systems in just about any modern camera. People always think, oh, I will just get it, but you don't just get focus. When you're talking about high megapixel cameras and super sharp lenses, the focal plane is 2-dimensional. It's literally 2-dimensional. It has no width. There is no depth of field. If you miss by an infinitesimal amount, then that image is going to be a little bit less sharp. So if I do a side-by-side test and I'm comparing sharpness of the lens, then how do I control for the natural variation in focus? Focus is not a precise thing. Camera, you can focus 10 times on a subject and it will not be quite exactly the same. I promise this because I've tested so many cameras in highly controlled situations. Every type of focus has some amount of variation in it. The way we control for it is all of my studio setups are a 3-dimensional setup. I won't just have a chart, but I'll have stuff in front of the chart and behind the chart, or whatever point I've decided to focus on. And then if I find that camera A is sharper than camera B, then I take a look at camera B's picture and I look in the foreground. And if a foreground subject is sharper than that same subject on camera A's image, then I know the difference isn't the lens necessarily, but that the focusing point shifted. And I'll look in the background too, because sometimes the focusing point will shift backwards or forwards. And it's not necessarily that it needs focus calibration, because focusing points are not one-dimensional. They take up a certain amount of space. And so sometimes they will focus towards the bottom of the point that I picked or up towards the top, even if we're talking about a very small slice of the image. And even if I've done my very best to line it up completely perpendicular with the focal plane, seems like there's always like a little bit of tilt in there. It can be kind of impossible to do it precise enough to keep up with today's super high resolution sensors and super high resolution lenses. So the focusing system isn't perfect, and that's why we have that control of providing a 3-dimensional studio so that I can actually compare it and see if I did blow the results. And guess what? I often have to go back and shoot again because I did blow the results. And I see big testing sites blow the results and they end up publishing them, and maybe they have to retract them. But I think there's also tests out there that have been published and probably shouldn't have been published, but maybe they don't have the controls in place to acknowledge that. I also say depth of field is not technically real. Like I said, depth of field is this 2-dimensional thing, and a lot of testers are like, oh, well, yeah, they might be slightly out of focus. The focus might have varied a little bit between them, but it's all within the depth of field. I measured it. It's a 16 millimeter lens. I have a foot depth of field, so everything's fine. No, that's absolute nonsense. If you miss by the tiniest immeasurable amount, you'll notice that the focal plane is a little bit less sharp. And if that's what you're looking at and you're really nitpicking like we do, then you're going to see a difference, and it's not going to be attributable to the lens. It's going to be attributable to the camera's focusing system or your focusing practices. I also say everything shakes. In the past, I've tried to do tests on the second story of my house, and that went out real fast because a car can go past and it can shake enough to ruin my pictures. The wind can blow. I started doing it on the first floor of my house, and I had to stop doing that too because people might be walking around. Or even then, cars and wind and stuff can shake the house. It's a solid house, but it can shake it enough to introduce enough unsharpness to the image that it will skew my results. So now if you notice, all our tests take place in the basement, which has a concrete floor, and I use a super heavy tripod, and I use a lot of repetition. But even with my repetition, I might take 10 pictures sequentially. I will see that some of them have a little bit of movement in them. Even though I literally stand next to it and hold my breath and don't move, there will still be some movement in the images that I can't explain. And I don't know, maybe there's nuclear tests going on somewhere in the world, but these sorts of shakes happen all the time. That's how I control for them. I do a lot of scrutinizing of images and comparing the same camera's images to other images from the same camera to see if there's any difference and to make sure that I pick the absolute sharpest image. I don't know. Maybe other people do this too. It's a painful process. I suspect it probably takes way too long. So I also want to go back to the practical part of this. Focusing is more important than sharpness. You can get the sharpest lens in the world, but if it doesn't focus accurately, then what does that sharpness even mean? Example, the Sigma 50 to 100 f1.8 and the Sigma 18 to 35 f1.8. Both lenses, the sharpest APS-C lenses we've tested, but I love the sharpness of them in the studio tests. Bought them, took them out into the real world, and they proceeded to just misfocus all the time. They would hit focus sometimes. It wasn't a focus calibration thing. It was a focus variation thing. It was because the camera bodies were not tested with the lenses because they're third-party lenses, and we see this sort of misfocusing in third-party lenses a lot just because, again, they don't have that integration with the manufacturer. There's not as much QA that goes on. The focusing actually will simply not be as good as native mount lenses. And this probably doesn't appear with your kit lenses or with your f4 lenses because, again, they're not super sharp and they probably have enough depth of field that you don't notice those little variations. But when you start dealing with super sharp lenses, you take off the AA filters and you count in lots of megapixels, you realize, yeah, sharpness doesn't mean much unless focusing accuracy is absolutely perfect. Speaking of focusing, I see a lot of focusing tests out there, and a lot of them are also deeply flawed and can lead you to some wrong conclusions. And I will start with one that I did myself. This is the last time we did a objective focusing test where I actually counted up the number of shots that were hit from a camera and gave it a score. I think it was a long time ago. It was the D500. It was probably the D500. And I remember we got the Samsung NX1 in the same day. And so I decided I would test the mirrorless camera, an NX1 that's now discontinued, against the D500 and the 7D Mark II, and I couldn't believe it. I was shook because the NX1 won the focusing test. And at that point in history, mirrorless cameras couldn't focus very well at all. So I was blown away. I thought this was going to change everything. We put out the review. We warned people, like, wait for the full review. This is preliminary. But what we're finding now is the NX1 just rocks at focusing. And then that weekend I took it to my kid's soccer game, and it was absolutely awful at shooting sports. It could focus as long as somebody was moving consistently in a straight line towards the camera. But as people dodged and darted and I shot and bursts and let off, the camera just couldn't keep up at all. Every time I tried to reinitiate focus, it would have to hunt. So in other words, the NX1 had kind of found a way to game my focusing test, which was having somebody walk directly towards the camera, but it didn't work in the real world at all. So we stopped doing those types of tests because I realized whatever test I come up with, somebody can hack together a solution that will make the camera perform well in that test, but won't necessarily perform in the real world. So now if I do a focusing test, I literally will just go shoot a soccer game and then give you my subjective results. And I'm sorry I can't make bar charts and stuff anymore because I know nerds love numbers and stuff, but now you're just going to have to deal with my subjective results. But I promise you they're way more meaningful than me counting shots that were in focus. People also don't account for the focusing point spread. So the Canon 6D Mark II has a pretty good focusing system, but all the points are right in the middle. And so what if you don't compose all your shots with the subject dead center in the middle? You can use an old technique called focus and recompose, where you focus on the subject and then you recompose the shot. But that inherently causes the focus to shift a little bit. You're also delaying the time between focusing and taking the shot, and the movement of the human body, the movement of your subject is going to mean less focusing precision. And as we said earlier, imprecise focusing means less sharpness. Your high megapixel camera, all your sharp lenses and stuff, all that goes out the window because you just missed focus. Modern cameras like the new Sony a7 III has focusing points that go out to the edge, and that's super awesome. That's so much better than having focusing points in the middle. And even if it's not as high of a megapixel, if I can actually precisely focus on something up in the corner of the frame, then I'm going to get sharper images out of it. It's also not accounting for eye detection focusing, which we found to be really useful. Because with something like the Canon 5 DSR or any DSLR really, you end up kind of moving the thumbstick around when you're shooting portraits and putting it over the nearest eye and then shooting. And then, maybe you want to move the face from the left to the right of the frame or go from horizontal vertical. You kind of repeat this process of moving the thumbstick around. And not only does that slow your whole process down, but the point might not line up directly on the eye. It might end up hitting their brow or their nose or something. So you lose some number of shots because the focusing points don't zero in on the person's iris, which is probably where you want to focus. It'll be a little bit off. The modern eye detection focusing systems, like those that we see from Sony and Fuji, they will use phase detect to get in close in range and then use contrast detect where they're literally reading the data from the sensor to actually find and zero in on the eye. And they're not perfect either. They still miss some portion of shots. Maybe it's half of the shots. Maybe it's more than half of the shots. But when they hit, they can be more precise. And certainly in the future, as that technology evolves, we're going to see it get more and more accurate. Anyway, I just want to say, eye detection is probably more meaningful than megapixels and ISO noise and stuff. It's like this practical improvement. There's also no accounting for focusing point selection speed. So I see a lot of cameras that have a good focusing system, but they don't have a thumbstick in there. And if you're trying to shoot sports or something and you can't get the focusing point on your subject in time and you just miss it, then your picture's out of focus. And again, all the technical aspects of it go out the window if you can't get your focusing point selected. They also don't necessarily account for how a camera tracks a subject moving across the frame. And just try doing some flying bird photography, for example, where it's really important to track the subject as it moves across the frame. You can get yourself a high megapixel camera and a super sharp lens, and then when you get back home and half your pictures are out of focus or more than half your pictures are out of focus, you're going to end up being really frustrated again because your sharp lens didn't end up mattering because the focusing system couldn't keep up with the subject. And the last focusing problem I really see common in tests, and I've done this too, is we will hold up the camera and prove to you that it's focusing by showing you the live view from the back of the camera, but this does not necessarily mean those shots are going to be in focus. It'll draw the little green eye, the green circle around wherever it's focusing or the person's eye, and it seems really impressive. But in my experience, I've done that, gone back and actually looked at the pictures and been like, oh wait, some of those pictures are actually out of focus. But it had the box on there. I just want to warn people, if you see these focusing tests, seeing a box drawn around something does not mean that's actually in focus. It can still be a little bit out of focus. You're going to notice the focusing problems more if you're using a fast lens. You know, if you're using a 200 millimeter f2.8 lens, you've got a really shallow depth of field going there. If it misses by the tiniest amount, it's going to be a little bit off. All your megapixels are out the window, right? If you're shooting with a kit lens and it's f5.6, you can miss focus by a lot and you probably just wouldn't notice. So for our own reviews, we've been reprioritizing this, and you've probably seen this in some of the recent reviews. We're not all about just numbers and ISO and all that because it honestly doesn't seem to matter that much anymore. And when I work with real people out there and I look at their pictures and the things that they're struggling with, it's not like it used to be. It used to be people were taking pictures of their kids' indoor basketball game and that there was so much noise in the pictures that they didn't even want to put them on Facebook. Cameras have evolved to the point now where that problem is mostly taken care of. We have brand new problems like, hey, the pictures look okay, but they're all out of focus, or I couldn't keep my kid in the frame, whatever. So we've been reprioritizing our reviews. We're focusing more on the more practical aspects of camera improvements, things like how much an electronic viewfinder can improve your photography. Still going to do some technical tests because I know a lot of you are here to see that kind of stuff, but maybe it'll be a little bit further back, and maybe I'll warn you like, hey, this doesn't matter as much as having a good touchscreen. If you want to learn the actual important parts of photography, we have books on that too. Even before we started YouTube, we wrote Stunning Digital Photography, and it's been the /1 photography book for probably 5 years now. If you don't have it, definitely check it out. The ebook's only $10. It includes 14 hours of video. You can go to scp.io/store. That's our website. We ship worldwide, or you can just go to Amazon. If you use our website, here's a 10% off coupon code. It's YouTube. We also have books on Lightroom with 14 hours of video, Photoshop with 10 hours of video, a photography buying guide that covers all the nitpicky stuff about cameras, lenses, studio lighting, whatever photography gear you want to know, and the art and science of photography, which has 10 hours of video you've never seen before and takes everything to the next level. It's a deeper type of video than we put on YouTube. You should definitely check it out and subscribe. And if you have any follow-up questions or comments, write a comment down below and I'll try to follow up. Thanks.